Oh, well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this very special event in our Identity, Vocation and Mission. And I'd like to welcome our special guest, and I'm going to get her to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her background, and maybe she can even reveal how we even became friends, that I can call on her to speak about this wonderful topic of charism. And of course, this came out of our last tutorial where Rachel and Gail were asking questions about personal charism and communal charism. So, Clara, a brief introduction, please.
Thanks, Deb. Gosh, we do go back a fair way to when we were both students at CTC, which was a long time ago. And yeah, but it's funny because we've reconnected in interesting places. And I think we reconnected when Father Anthony Walsh, with whom I've done some work, a Dominican priest, told me I should meet you because you were doing work on charisms and you were looking at organisational charisms. But Father Anthony and I are co-directors of the Catherine of Siena Institute, which actually helps people discern their personal charisms. And we've been doing that a very long time, actually. And in addition to that, I've worked in various educational capacities, including lecturing in church history at Catholic Theological College. And I'm currently working for the Australian Catholic Bishops' Conference as Executive Secretary for, amongst other things, their Commission for Evangelisation, Laity and Mission. So I guess we're still on the same track, Deb.
we are. We just keep reconnecting back in those. I think we met in spirituality class.
Possibly.
With Austin.
Austin Cooper, who at the age of 90 is now lecturing online.
Wow. And he's my supervisor for my PhD on charism. So.
And my supervisor for my history PhD.
Oh, there you go. There you go. So here we are, parallel tracks as well as interconnections. Well, Clara, I thought it'd be really good to start with perhaps a definition of charism. We're looking, of course, from the Ignatian spiritual tradition, and then you're coming in from the Dominican and other traditions. But just talk around about what is charism, because I think it's a most often used term and a most misunderstood term.
Absolutely. Look, there's a number of ways that we can... The term charism is used in a number of different ways. The way in which I'm most familiar is in helping people discern their personal charisms. And this is an interesting phenomenon because I think in the early church, people presumed that someone would begin to manifest charisms after they were baptized, because charisms are a gift of the Holy Spirit and they are supernatural gifts. And if you think back to Paul, to the Corinthians, he talks about gifts of teaching and administration and service and various other things, which are gifts that are given for building up the body of Christ, but also to help people fulfill their mission in the world. After the Second Vatican Council, there was a sort of a return to this idea of charism, but it hasn't really been fully explored. I guess what we've really seen is the development of the charismatic movement, and people have been happy to sort of relegate charisms over to there. And people tend to think of charisms as being associated with emotion or sort of some spiritual energy, which they are and they aren't. You know, a lot of very boring, sober people have charisms. And also, I think a lot of the focus has been on the more spectacular charisms, such as, you know, healing or we don't even talk about the charism of speaking in tongues, because our definition of charisms is that it's a gift of the Holy Spirit given to a person for the sake of others. And the gift of tongues isn't really for the sake of others. The gift of tongues is really a personal consolation, if you like. It doesn't have any outward manifestation for others. So, you know, we talk about pretty boring gifts like administration or teaching or service, and also, you know, leadership and encouragement. And yes, healing and prophecy are in there too, but they're amongst the rarer charisms. There are fewer people who seem to manifest those charisms. So that's the context in which I'm working with the Siena Institute and the Called and Gifted workshop that we run through the Institute.
Yeah, thank you. I think there's a distinction between an outpouring of the charism in certain times. So the charism can manifest itself, like you're saying, in times that that's needed, and that's more of the type of manifestation. Whereas like yourself, I think someone's personal charism, it will manifest itself in that person's call, their mission, and I think it really shapes their identity rather than being a particular gift or talent for a certain work or for a
Indeed.
certain time.
And the charisms we discern are charisms that are, we would say, habitually given. They're charisms that the person generally has. There may, however, also be a temporary gift that will manifest in an extraordinary time because that particular extraordinary grace is given. For example, someone who doesn't normally experience the healing of other people may, in a particular time of crisis, heal somebody, but that gift is not normally manifest. But, you know, if they have a gift of teaching, they generally teach. If they have a gift of administration, they might be a very good executive assistant, etc. So, yes, there are those distinctions.
Yeah, sure. I think that's something in the Ignatian spiritual tradition that, originally they saw themselves as these pilgrim priests, and we're going to go off and live where Jesus lived, serve where Jesus served, and then that gets blocked. And they've never locked themselves down to a particular work. So although they worked in hospitals, they didn't see themselves as only working in hospitals as part of their charism. Then they got into universities and schools, but education was bigger than formal education for them. And I think the diversity among the Jesuits, who are scientists, astronomers, etc., is all, while they're all part of one corporate charism, you can really see the individual charisms there, just defining for them, drawing them into their mission and their own, according to their own personal vocation.
Yes. And look, I think that's true of priests and religious too. I think being aware of their personal charisms will actually shape how they live out their priesthood or religious life. No two people will have the same set of charisms, and no two ordained persons or no two religious will live their life necessarily in the same way. So I think that's a really, and I think we sort of we sell the church short, or the church is selling itself short by not encouraging that discernment of charism, so that people can work in areas where they are more likely to be fruitful. My joke is I spent half my life beating myself up because I wasn't a good Catholic, because I wasn't like Mother Teresa. And then I discovered, well, no, I didn't have a charism of mercy, so I wasn't being asked to do what Mother Teresa was doing. And I think that's really important.
Yeah, it is. And I think that's one of the great strengths of the exercises, is that you follow through this particular sequence of patterns of prayers, meditations, but the dynamics that are happening is that you're discovering your own identity before God, your vocation, your mission, and then finally your name of grace, your own personal first name and also your last name of the community that you're called to serve with. Which leads me, speaking of the exercises, which is for us, our particular way of proceeding, to use a Jesuit term, in that discovery of your identity to become a disciple of Jesus. I think it'd be really interesting to hear from you, what sort of formation program have you established for discovering personal charism in the work that you're doing? And maybe if you could talk us through some of your work that you've been doing in that area.
Well, I can't claim any credit for it because I sort of hopped on board to someone else's program. But, interesting movement of the spirit, because the very first time I ever surfed the internet, and it was 1998, I came onto the Catherine of Siena website, and they'd only been live for a few months. And I thought some of their material sounded very, very interesting. So I phoned one of the co-directors in the States, Sherry Waddell, and we had a phone conversation, and I ordered some materials which duly arrived. And then 6 months later, she phoned me and she said she'd been invited to go to New Zealand to speak at the Eucharistic Congress. How far was Australia from New Zealand? So, so I suggested she'd better sort of hop across, and she was in touch with a priest in the Broken Bay diocese. So she ran a workshop in Broken Bay on the Saturday, and then I was living in Newcastle at the time. So she came up to Newcastle and ran a workshop in Newcastle on the Tuesday. And we had 50 people attend. And it was just really, really well received. And it was all about how to discern personal vocation or personal charisms. And since then, I've been interested. We then had Sherry Waddell is her name, and you may have come across her. She's come out to Australia half a dozen times since then. But we had her train a group of people back in 2004. And the way the process works is there is an inventory which asks sort of general questions, but the questions are focused in trying to identify patterns in one's life. And then the rest of the workshop unpacks what that means and how charisms actually work in a community, which is fascinating. And we might get onto that later. But then we offer people a one-on-one interview to help them discern and hone in a little more closely onto what their own particular gifts are. But that's just the beginning of the process. They've then got to go off and do the work in terms of evaluating whether that is in fact their gift. And we basically have 3 touchstones for evaluating. One is a subjective one. It's how one feels. And when one's exercising a charism, you actually feel as though you fit. You sort of feel that this is what you were made for, that you could actually keep doing this for a very long time without tiring. That doesn't mean you're not washed out at the end of it, but it's a place that gives you joy and peace. And I think the Ignatian discernment identifies that same sort of thing. So that's a subjective feeling. But then we also look at whether the charism actually achieves what it's meant to achieve. You know, if you have a charism of teaching, are your students learning? If you have a charism of mercy, do you help people in very material and concrete ways? And then also people recognise that charism and you get feedback. And that may be direct feedback, like, you know, you're a great teacher, or it may be indirect feedback in that people keep coming around to your house and telling you their life story over a cup of tea. And they go away saying, gee, that felt really good. And you may actually have the gift of encouragement. And so you're only being told that indirectly. And I think certainly in the Australian church, we're not very good at affirming people openly. So often you have to look for those indirect signs of affirmation. So that's the workshop in a nutshell. But there are really interesting implications of how it works in a community and how discerning our charisms prevents us from burning out, but it also prevents us from judging others, because you come to realise that they have different gifts and you actually don't understand how their gifts work. And so you trust that the Holy Spirit will work through them. And just by way of illustration, there's this nice story about 2 women who had a charism of music. And they're both involved in pastoral ministry, but each hates the way the other plays. Because one of them has people wanting to dance in the aisle, and the other has this sort of quiet, soporific music. But once they learnt that one of them also had a charism of evangelism and the other had a charism of healing, then their music makes sense. So it's not about judging people, it's about making room for people. And that's really important in building up community.
Yeah, we have similar examples of that, or highlight some examples that, you know, like for Bellarmine to be raised to the alders of the church, to live a rich life, to have servants, etc., fitted with his charism. It didn't fit with Francis of Assisi, who is called to poverty. But both are saints and both fulfilled what they were called to be and to do. And I think that picks it up on, you can't judge another person from what you're called to do and your perspective, because And I think what you were talking about before was that sense of consolation, that in doing that, there's a sense of consolation. It doesn't leave you, as Ignatius said, leaves you dry. It leaves you actually feeling consoled, and that's an affirming disposition that you're aware of. Just to take you back, when you said you discovered what your charism was not, how did you discover that? How did you discover, after beating yourself up for not being a sister of charity with your one bucket, two saris and sandals, what led you to that discovery?
Well, I think it was just exploring the charisms as I did through my own exploration of the called and gifted process. I thought, oh gosh, I haven't scored anything in mercy. That doesn't mean I'm a nasty person and not compassionate or anything like that. It's just not where I'm called. It's not where God wants me. So I found myself somewhere else. The fact that I had uncovered the called and gifted process, I suddenly found myself doing a lot of formation of lay people. I guess I've discerned my charisms as teaching and encouragement. And there's another one there that sort of hovers in the background, and I'll wait and see what happens there. But I'm quite happy working within those parameters.
Yeah, thank you. And so, I mean, having looked at that and looked at individual and discovering individual, what about the connection then? Like, once we discover, what our charism is not, which is just as important, I think, than as what it is, how then do we know how to connect? Like, how do we find community in that?
I think if you begin to exercise your charism, community finds you. Because you actually put yourself out there to do the things you're called to do, and you find yourself in a place where that is welcomed and encouraged and asked of you. Is that too ephemeral?
No, not at all. I mean, I was just thinking about it's interesting with discovery of charisms, because I was just thinking then of Peter Faber and Francis Xavier with Ignatius. Like, on the one hand, Ignatius with Peter Faber, he got it immediately. He goes, yes, I feel that connected with Ignatius of Loyola and his mission. But Francis Xavier, no, very resistant. And one of the great lines, I think, a classic line of all the saints, is Ignatius saying that Francis Xavier was the lumpiest dough he ever had to knead.
But there was perhaps the greatest missionary vocation of all time.
Just waiting to be rolled out. Thanks.
See, we talk about the please don't send me to Africa syndrome. And Newman talks about it too, that we have this idea, and actually Benedict XVI talked about it too, that we have this idea that if God's going to ask something of us, he's going to ask us to do something really horrible that we really don't want to do. Whereas what God's actually calling us into is to be the person we are called to be. And interestingly, I had a woman who had an MBA, and she'd gone off to do some missionary work in Africa. And her family kept writing to her saying, come back, use your education for what it was meant to be used for. Anyway, she came back to Australia. She did a called and gifted workshop, and she's gone back to Africa. So for her, God was calling her to Africa, MBA notwithstanding. And God does have a sense of humour.
Yes. As I'm sure we've all discovered at different times, and will continue to discover into the future. So what about if we look at, the religious orders are sort of obvious. Maybe if we look at those first, and then maybe though for today, where it's less likely that we find our community in a sort of a formalised setting. So with the religious orders, I mean, some of them die off, others have lasted. A number of the apostolic orders today tended to have survived. The Jesuits have been around almost 500 years. The Dominicans have been around
something, yep.
for 800, I know. So, you know, oh my gosh, nearly going forward, if they're there for another 200, 1,000, like a millennium, which is just pretty incredible, really, when you look at the history of other orders in the church. So, what do you think? What do you think helps for a religious order to be able to go across cultures, across millennia, and still contribute to the church?
Well, I mean, it is interesting in that, you know, the orders we've spoken to, you know, the Benedictines as well. I mean, they have been around for a long time, and they do tend to have a sort of fundamental rule of life, which travels with them wherever they go. And it's a way of being and a way of relating to the world and to God and to each other. And yes, we talk about charisms associated with orders, and, you know, we'll talk about the Benedictines as having a charism of hospitality and the Dominicans a charism of preaching. I don't know what what do the Jesuits identify as their charism? It's probably not that easily encapsulated.
Well, it's actually, interestingly, if you say way of proceeding, all Jesuits know what that means. It's a way of proceeding rather than a particular work. So it's the way that they discern what they're being called to do in order to move closer to Jesus. And I mean, we could probably, finding God in all things, if you ask people, they'll go, oh, finding God in all things sums up the charism, which it does. It does. But to find God, there's a particular way of discerning the presence of God in your own life.
Well, I think it's interesting because I recently caught up with an old friend of mine who spent some time in the Jesuits. He's now in a senior role in Catholic healthcare, and he said not a day goes past when he doesn't tap into that Jesuit formation, even though he's now a layman in the world. So I guess that's what I'm saying about having this way of life and a sort of grounding that stays with you wherever you go and whatever you do. There's still, and I think that's why some of the religious orders have been able to translate across cultures. So there's a groundedness. And I think that groundedness comes in doing the will of God in whatever way it's manifest.
Yeah, it's the same. We haven't got numbers on it, but when Ignatius started, he was really guiding people through the exercise, lay people, mainly women. You know, a number of women prior to the Society of Jesus being formed. So we don't have all of the people who have connected and found their vocations, their charisms through that. I mean, if you look at a modern order like the Salesians, Don Bosco gave 10,000 priests to the church, other than the Salesians, and it was through. But obviously, they've taken that charism. That charism has borne fruit in other ways, and I think with all the charisms that we're talking about, the fact that laity can identify and feel a part of it, like Ignatian spirituality. Now, there's more lay people identifying with that than Jesuits across the world. Same, and look at the Dominicans. So the charism has a way of embracing even those who don't live by the rule or how the charism was codified originally.
Well, I laugh because I've lived in so many different cities, and, you know, last time we talked I was in Ballarat, now I'm in Canberra, and I tend to laugh and say, you know, the mendicant thing is a Dominican thing, but most of the friars have far more stability than I've had. You know, I am a member of the Dominican laity, but I didn't think that sort of mendicant aspect applied to the laity. But, you know, here I am. Yeah, and it is funny. It is funny how, it attracts people with certain predispositions. But also, you know, getting back to the charism of orders. Now, in a sense, the religious orders appropriated the charisms, I think, in an era where if you aspired to the life of perfection, you joined religious life, and the laity were just sort of also rands who sort of lived some sort of mediocre Christian life. Whereas Vatican II has affirmed quite strongly that everyone is called to holiness through baptism, and the charisms are given to everyone. So we've got to return to this idea of personal charism as opposed to an organisational or a group charism. But that organisational charism, that group charism, can actually shape the members of that organisation. And you've experienced it in schools. I know of your background, but, you know, and I know you taught at Siena, and I was saying earlier that you would probably have noticed that not every Dominican has the charism of preaching as a personal charism, but they all share in that charism of the order. And similarly, not all Benedictines are personally very hospitable, but the way of living of that order is in itself hospitable. So it sort of makes up for, the charism makes up for the deficit of particular individuals.
Yeah, and that's an interesting point that you're raising, that it's collectively that the charism is being fully expressed. So you have your own personal charism and gifts, but then you find yourself with a community, and usually I think that's a shared mission. I think that a lot of times hierarchical church undermines the mission, that and how much that can connect. You know, they'll make statements, some will make statements like, oh, it's all very well to know about Edmund Rice, but do they know about Jesus? But Eddie Rice leads you to Jesus. Ignatius leads you to Jesus. Dominic leads you to Jesus. And people can share in the mission without having a faith background or a purpose, but then find their lives enriched, and perhaps they are discovering their own charism through participation in the mission, rather than the mission being an outflow of the charism.
Which is interesting, and it's, you know, chicken and egg stuff, which comes first. And I think, you know, you've got to have one in order to have the other. And I guess my frustration at the moment is, you know, the idea of mission or maintenance. A lot of parishes and a lot of church organisations are locked in this maintenance mode. And my fear is that unless they start doing mission, they'll just be shifting deck chairs on the Titanic. And it's interesting because the recent instruction from the Congregation for Clergy talks about evangelization as being the heart of the Christian mission, not just for the ordained, but also for the laity. It's the mission we all share, and we are required to be co-responsible for that mission. And the document goes on to say that it's not just about evangelizing individuals, but about evangelizing structures. And we need to change those structures so they are more responsive to the mission of the church, because the structure in and of itself is of no use, of no service. It's only when it's used for mission that it's enlivened and grows.
And now I think what we're moving to, looking at, there is a tension. There's always been a tension between the hierarchical church and the charisms. When charisms have been quashed or attempted to be, it's really just through fear that they're not fitting into those systems or fitting into those structures. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of those tensions?
Well, those tensions are definitely there. And I mean, if we look at the sort of the more recent church history in the last 300 or 400 years, or maybe even going back to another Ignatian model, and that is someone like Mary Ward and the Loreto sisters. I mean, Mary Ward never had an intention of establishing a religious congregation. She saw her mission as that of enabling well-to-do laywomen to educate others in the faith. But the hierarchical church didn't know how to deal with women running around teaching others, and insisted that they live within the confines of a convent. But in very recent history, looking at people like Dorothy Day, I think Dorothy Day is a particularly good example in that, you know, she was a former communist, and just because she became a Catholic, she didn't give up being a social activist. And, you know, she set up homes for the poor and offered them accommodation and material assistance, she also protested against war and against poverty and found herself in jail a number of times. As a laywoman, she was acting within her call, within the jurisdiction of her call. And, you know, the clergy have jurisdiction within the confines of the church. Lay people take their baptismal jurisdiction into the world, and there they have to bear fruit. And lay people can do that because Dorothy Day wasn't committing the whole church to that particular course of action, but she was answering her call. And so in some ways there is a tension, and, you know, some of the bishops weren't quite sure what to do with her. But in that tension, the church has come to understand other ways of embracing the social justice mission. So in some ways, it's those lay people with their charisms who are pushing the boundaries, and the church doesn't catch up for a while. But that's a really necessary tension.
Yeah, it is. And I mean, you've cited Dorothy Day, and if we sat for a while, we could probably list a whole range of lay people, especially
Caroline Chisholm.
Yeah. Exactly.
Archbishop Polding just did not get what she was on about. And she felt, and she could have been doing called and gifted, she felt that God had bestowed her with the gifts she needed for the task at hand.
Yeah, and you look at the tension between Mary MacKillop and the official church. Yeah. You know, I mean, even to the point of excommunication, and tick for the Jesuits in giving her secret communion and during those times. But yeah, I mean, it's always a lot of women, I think, to challenge the church, because they seem to just get on with it and say, oh yeah, this is what I'm meant to do. They're not thinking about, oh, how does this look politically, or you know, what are the other consequences, seeing the need and responding to it because they feel drawn to it.
Yeah.
Well, is there anything else that you'd like, that's come to you that you'd like to mention?
Not overtly. I think we've covered the key aspects, including the points of contention.
Yeah. We have, without getting ourselves excommunicated, which is always.
I work for the bishops now. I've got to be very careful.
we all come under the oversight, but what I'd like to ask you then is, I've got two more questions, and they're more just of a personal nature. Is there a book that you have gifted more to people than others, and which book is that?
Oh, look, I guess I've been giving away copies of Sherry Waddell's Forming Intentional Disciples, which is interesting because the Pope, the Holy Father, talks about missionary disciples. And really, Sherry's concept of intentional disciples is exactly that. So the Institute has now started talking about missionary disciples rather than intentional disciples. And it's this idea that Christians need to be formed in such a way that they encounter Christ and choose to follow him. So it's that intentionality. And I think what we're doing a lot of is sacramentalizing, but we're not evangelizing. So we give people baptism, but if you like, you hand them the gift and we don't help them unwrap it.
That's an interesting, that's very interesting, and it's true. What about now? I mean, how does that play out now, where we're all locked down?
Well, I've never been more connected to really, really interesting things. I went before lockdown. I was in New York. I came back as one of probably one of the first plane loads that had to go into mandatory self-isolation. But I went over to the States. I was supposed to go to a conference in New York, which was cancelled, but I decided to go to a conference at Notre Dame on called and co-responsible, which was really interesting in terms of the co-responsibility of the church. And since then, they've been running a whole lot of online seminars that I can sign up for and then watch later. And the Melbourne Archdiocese is running a series of online talks. Last week they had Father James Mallon from Halifax, Nova Scotia, the author of Divine Renovation. And next week they've got Bishop Nicholas Hudson from Westminster, who's also done work on evangelising teams. So suddenly in COVID, we're accessing all these wonderful things online, which we could have done before, but never thought of doing.
No, that's true. I think we're finding new ways to connect and to build relationships. So just for a parting word, Clara, if you could put a sentence or a few words on a billboard on Monash Freeway, what would that billboard say?
How do you know you haven't met Jesus?
Oh, okay. So there's the challenge. There's a challenge for all of us. Probably for all of us, how do you know you have met Jesus and how do you know you haven't? And, yeah, sorry.
No, well, I just think people have preconceptions. It's like a story that Sherry tells about a pastor who meets this fellow who's an atheist and asks him why he's an atheist. And this fellow goes on to describe that, I can't believe in a God who does X, Y, and Z. And the pastor said, well, I don't believe in that God either.
Well, that's right. Look, Clara, thank you for your time today. Thank you for sharing your experience, both personally and professionally. Good luck with your work with the bishops. And also too in Charism, if some students would like to ask you a few more questions personally and or something struck them in what you've said, if it's okay with you, I might put them in touch via email or I can send it on.
Email would be the best way to go. Yeah.
All right then. Well, thanks very much. Enjoy
Okay.
the rest of your afternoon. And it's been a pleasure.
Thanks. Bye.